All right. Just give it a couple more minutes and as people keep trickling on. And again, thank you everyone for coming up tonight. We are really excited to be presenting this information and get together as a community. This presentation is hopefully not going to be the last one in this series. Our hope is that this is an ongoing conversation within the community. And so we have invited a lot of different people tonight, not only as guest speakers, but as participants who are watching. Our hope is that people become engaged and excited about this conversation and want to continue the conversation afterwards. So we have invited parents, we've invited community and business leaders, we have invited teachers as well as prevention advocates that are on the line that I get the pleasure of working with. So again, this is kind of the introduction to what it means to engage men and boys in preventing domestic violence. This work is incredibly important, and a little bit of background on how we decided to create this webinar. So I got put into contact with April fairly soon after I started working at Safe Harbor. For those of you who do not know, I am the prevention advocate at Safe Harbor. My name is Myra Gerst, and I got put in contact with April. She is a past client of Safe Harbors, a survivor of domestic violence, and she was coming around sharing the book that she has written. And I was really intrigued by her story and contacted her, and she was really excited to share her knowledge. Not only is April a writer, a public speaker, but she's also a teacher, and she has a lot of really valuable knowledge to share, not only in those roles, but also as a survivor. So we got to talking about, what can we do in the community to make an impact? How can our voices, how can her voice make an impact through Safe Harbor? And we started talking about how there's little to no work being done in engaging men and boys. And if there is work that's being done, it's really hard to engage men and boys because of the stigmas that are surrounded with domestic violence and sexual assault. And so I have a couple more people entering, so I'm gonna let them in real quick. So we decided that this idea of engaging men and boys was something that we really wanted to focus on. We wanted to, dive into some research and figure out what are the programs that are out there and what is it that we can do to try and take a step forward in bringing this information into the community. So we went back and forth on a lot of different ideas. At first, we decided that we were going to create a curriculum and put that into schools and share it with the community. And then we kind of came back and we're like, you know what? We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of really good information that's out there that's being utilized by various communities. It's not being utilized, I know, very much in the community that we're working with in Safe Harbor, at Safe Harbor. But it is out there. So we decided to create a resource hub for people like you all who are interested in this work. And I'm going to get a little bit more into the resource hub at the very end of the webinar. But first and foremost, I just want to, again, thank everyone for attending. And I really hope that you're intrigued by this conversation. If you have questions throughout, please either unmute yourself or type it in the chat box. Again, we would really love for this to be a conversation. We do have really incredible guest speakers with us tonight. So first and foremost, I'm going to turn the time over to April. She's going to share a little bit more about herself and share some stories with you all, and then we'll get into our guest speakers.
Thank you so much, Myra. So if my hands start flying, it's because I'm used to interpreting. I have 9 children, and number 6 and number 8 were born deaf. So I try to always remember that possibility of having a deaf audience. I don't know if there will be anyone here tonight, but so not that I'm a licensed interpreter, but if they start flying, that's why. And I get excited. So like she said, my name is April Tribe-Duke, and I am a victor over domestic violence, left my situation November 28th, 2006, and have been free from that for almost 14 years now. However, the situation was, it was at that point where I needed to find a protective order, and I had no idea how to even go about this. So when I left, a police officer was able to hand me a card with Safe Harbor's information on it. And he said, please contact this number. They're not there, but leave a message, because once your husband gets out, he'll post bail, but and get out. And if you've taken the kids, then I will probably get called to come after you for kidnapping. So please make that phone call. And that's something that I did right away, left the message, and within 24 hours we were in contact with someone from Safe Harbor, and they helped me go through the process of getting a protective order. And I used that protective order over 7 times, because that's how many times he violated it. And 4 of those 7 times met him with jail time. So it worked really well for me, in the sense that I always used it and kept it really active, and went through all of the things that you're supposed to do. So with that being said, years later, I get remarried and I have 4 more children. That's why we have 9. And the whole crux of writing the story was just to understand I wanted to give back. In 2000, and let's see, gonna make the year wrong. Hopefully I get it right. 2018, I think, or 17. Maybe it was 17. I was invited for the Evergreen benefit that Safe Harbor does in the fall, and invited to be a speaker there. So that was my first speaking about the situation, which was the very first time I'd ever actually expressed it to anyone. And so my family is sitting there hearing everything for the first time. And at that benefits conference, I also shared that I will have a book. And I didn't mean to say that, but it's kind of how things go. And so now my book is out and available, which shares the story. And then we have a second book, which talks about the healing. And the parts that were really interesting to me is I had lots of questions about my now ex-husband, and what could have happened. Was there anything prior to? Was this preventable? What signs did I miss? All of those things. So lots and lots of questions started to come out. And so when I was doing research as well as I was writing, that concept of, well, I have 5 boys. I want to make sure that we break the cycle. If there has been a cycle, I want to make sure that they're going to be, people who are great citizens, who love their family, who are not what I call hunters of the family, that they're there to protect, provide, and be a part of everything. And I just wanted to know more about how to do that. So that was the big motivation. And talking to other people about prevention is really interesting, because a lot of people will bat it down and say, well, that's a women's issue. No, actually, it's a family issue. Everyone's involved. And unfortunately, we know that statistically 90% of the perpetrators are male, but it's not to go in a direction of that per se. It is to go into a direction of, as a community, how do we help support and create opportunities for this cycle to break, for the chance for these boys to really become strong youth and to become incredible men. Isn't that what everyone wants to see? And I know that's been my motivation through all of this. So with all of that being said, in the research doing this, I fell upon some statistics that really shocked me, which you probably all very familiar with. And one was that I'll share right now before we get into what Marty's going to talk about. It has to do with business and lots of different businesses, entrepreneurship, all of these kinds of things. And the number was $9.4 billion. $9.4 billion are lost every year to domestic violence. That's staggering. And we know that a certain percentage of that is because basically you're just not showing up to work because you're at court, you're in the hospital, other things like that. Other pieces are you're late to work because you're your spouse, your partner, boyfriend, whoever it is, has hidden the keys, or at the last minute changes, childcare, and so you're showing up late. You're not able to stay for the amount of time. You're using a lot of insurance because of health claims, mental illness claims, all of these kinds of things. And when I present that, when I go to speak to businesses, I'll just say, pens start clicking and numbers start writing down. They're really surprised by that. And then we go in the statistics of how many of you in your, who work in your office are women, and just going off the percentage, 1 in 4. Now we just look at within the room. That means the possibility 6 people within this room are suffering in abuse. And just bringing it right there on their front step is pretty interesting and a powerful way to get the conversation really happening. Because what I found is that a lot of things, when we talk to men, boys, youth, they really great with solution seeking, which is fantastic because that's a strength and a skill. So we start to talk about ideas and implementation and what they can do. And so I'm really excited to hear what all of the speakers will be sharing in those pieces of it. And so that's just what I wanted to kind of start off tonight with. And as each speaker goes, I'll share a little bit more of some more of the story. Thank you, Mara.
Thank you. So next we're gonna be hearing from Marty. And Marty, remind me, am I sharing the screen with your face or without your face?
Can I share
oh,
the
yes.
screen?
I mean, I'll make you host. But which one?
It's gonna be the non-face screen.
Okay. There you go.
All right.
Take it away.
Let me. All right. Okay, hold on. All right, how's everybody doing? Good, I hope. Getting used to this medium of presenting has been, let me make sure this shows up. Mara, is this showing up on your screen?
Yes, it's showing up as like a.
Yeah, I'm realizing that. Hold on, let
pieces.
me see if I can share a different screen. All right. Sorry, y'all. I've almost got this perfected. We're so close. Okay. That should do it.
That's
all
good.
Right.
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. This presentation I normally get. So my name is Marty Liccardo. I work for the Utah State Department of Health in the Violence and Injury Prevention Program. Up until very recently, my title was Men's Engagement Specialist, and my role was to get more men actively involved in violence prevention. We have very recently changed that to Community Prevention Specialist, and this presentation will actually indicate why we've made that change. It will become a little more clear in a second, because my work is no less focused on men's engagement. That is a huge component of my my role at the health department. However, how we frame that and talk about it has shifted greatly, and I'll go into some detail about why that is. I also like to say, when people wonder why someone would be a men's engagement specialist, they often ask, why would the health department need that? I say, because 98% of all rape and sexual assault is perpetrated by men. And April illustrated some of the statistics on that as well. Since 98% of the sexual violence and relationship violence that exists in the world is perpetrated by men, that's why this role exists. Now, I often will follow that up with the question, do most men rape? And the answer is no, most men don't. Most men are wonderful, amazing people. Some of my best friends are men. I'm a man myself. So it's not a criticism of men, except to say men make up a grossly disproportionate number of the people perpetrating these crimes, which makes this, and April was kind of alluding to this as well, not a women's issue, which is the way we normally think about interpersonal violence, but a men's violence issue. Now, can women be violent and sexually violent? Of course they can. But there's something going on. There is a big difference when we look at statistics on gender related to who is perpetrating and often who is victims. Because one of the points I often like to make too is that men are often victims of other men's violence, which this issue is greater because although most men don't commit violence, or commit acts of violence, men can be a big component of the people who challenge that as well. They can be equal partners. I often like to say too that women have been doing the majority of the domestic violence prevention and intervention work for the last 20, 30, 2,000, 10,000 years. So this is part of the problem too, is that this has been women's work to take care of men's violence. And we're going to get into some nitty gritty. Now, this presentation I do on this for educators, community members, practitioners is usually 2 hours. I've distilled this into 10 minutes. And the 10 minutes you're going to get today is more of a conceptual challenge on how we talked about men's violence to men contemporarily. There are organizations that have been doing men's violence prevention work for about 40 years. The oldest is probably the National Organization of Men Against Sexism. None of you have probably heard of that organization. I'd be very shocked if anybody had. Most people have heard of the National Organization for Women. Most people have not heard of the National Organization for Men Against Sexism. And there's a reason for that too, is that there's not very many of us. There's not very many men speaking up or talking about this, which is what we're going to get into today as well. I do want to say too, as we start talking today, sometimes I've done this presentation, and especially people who work in violence intervention and prevention have gotten a little frustrated with me. I encourage you to challenge me or share with me or afterwards talk to me about this, because what I'm going to say is going to fly in the face of a lot of contemporary men's engagement work, because over the last 22 years in this field that I've worked, I've realized that most of what we've done related to getting men engaged does not work. We have failed miserably at this. So trying to shift that focus is what we're trying to do at the health department, and what a lot of great organizations in the Valley, including Safe Harbor, are doing, and other parts of the Valley, other parts of the state. So without further ado, it always gives me, hold on, let's see if we can make sure this starts moving. Okay, masculinity is neither a good thing or a bad thing. I usually like to have a discussion on this concept or topic. We're not going to do that today. This is the concept of masculinity or femininity are culturally constructed ideas. They shift and change over time. So these are also culturally and socially malleable ideas as well. Masculinity and femininity as concepts are neither good nor bad. However, how they are used to defend or explain away or remove accountability can be a big problem. And that's what we're going to get into today. I also want to say today's presentation, I'm going to sound very heteronormative and heterosexist. And what that means is I'm going to use very binary language with gender on men and women, even though I know there are gender variant folks in this conversation, in this webinar today in Utah and in the United States. This is not to diminish that. It's to say, unfortunately, how we think about and talk about interpersonal violence is often very binary and gendered as well, and often in a very traditional gendered way. So I do want to say, like, I don't want to mean to silence or misidentify or not talk about folks who are experience violence, especially when we know the statistics related to how those certain populations and vulnerable populations are impacted by it. But in understanding how we think about violence culturally and socially, it's generally traditional, and it's generally gender binary, and it's generally heteronormative. That means that we assume every relationship is heterosexual, which many are not. So, all right, that was my little disclaimer. Because a lot of queer kids have criticized my presentations over the last 5 years really appropriately, and I've learned. So, okay. I want to really quickly talk about the difference between individual and structural. That's a big component of the first part of this training that I do, spending some time talking about male privilege, white supremacy, and terms like toxic masculinity. These are all important terms. They do exist. The problem is that when we use these terms, we usually talk about them and folks who hear them on an individual from an individual perspective instead of the structural perspective where they come from. I will give you a great example. When I've done presentations on masculinity and healthy masculinity for men's organizations, specifically one time I did a fraternity. Actually, it was all fraternities at college in the West. A bunch of men said to me, "Are you calling me toxic? Are you saying that I'm toxic?" And so part of the issue too is this notion of, like, they identified strongly with masculinity in whatever way they identified it. And this term, without deep explanation or an understanding, just served to alienate instead of helping us move towards dialogue. I don't use these terms when I'm speaking to certain groups, especially with men I'm trying to begin the process of engagement with. So understanding that these terms are important, they're important academically and educationally, but they can be a barrier in certain ways, or we have to strategically, or in some cases surgically, use them. So male privilege is a set of privileges that are given to men as a class due to their institutional power in relation to women as a class. Every man experiences privilege differently. Every man experiences privilege differently due to his own individual position in the social hierarchy. Every man, by virtue of being read as male by society, benefits from these privileges. This is a true fact. This is a statement of fact. We could also make the same statement for male supremacy, white privilege, and race privilege in these ways. So understanding that these are important concepts in creating and forming your men's engagement protocols, and you should be involving this process in your planning, but how you talk about them and use them should be also thoughtful. Because I will tell you, it doesn't work if everybody doesn't listen to anything you say because they don't like the term toxic masculinity. And a lot of these terms we use with ease within this field, and we should need to be a little more thoughtful about that. In a nutshell, most men do not see this as their issue. Most men do not perceive themselves as the problem or any part of the problem. Men do not see themselves in general as perpetrators. Even perpetrators of sexual violence and relationship violence often don't see themselves that way. So we need to change our focus and our efforts towards men acting as change agents just to get their foot in the door. Now, this isn't to remove accountability for men, but saying that if you want men to start participating, male privilege gives them an automatic and an easy out, because once they say, well, they're not talking to me, they're talking about violent men or sexually aggressive men or sexist men or men who degrade women, that's not me. Even when they're culturally, socially participating in behaviors that actually perpetrate violence against women, perpetrate violence against men, perpetrate violence against LGBTQIA folks. So this gets complicated. But one of the things we've seen now is that, especially for those first line men, getting your average guy involved, it's important to understand they don't see themselves as this person you're talking to. So when we oftentimes use accountability language, it has the opposite effect that we'd like to understand. And I'll let you know that in the longer 2-hour section, I go into a lot of theoretical reasons for this. So I will tell you that if you're interested in that, call me up. Okay. So we often talked about that men are part of the problem. In the interest of time, and April already went through this in a really thorough way. I'm going to say that men commit most violence, whether it's stalking, dating violence, domestic violence, sexual harassment, or sexual assault. The vast majority of people who perpetrate this are men. Or when we talk about domestic and dating violence, especially when we talk about lethality, it's mostly men. This is a men's violence problem. However, it's also difficult to be male. It's difficult to be a guy. This is one of those concepts that people are like, oh, boo-hoo, poor guys. And I totally recognize and understand that response and attitude, especially when we understand how male supremacy and male privilege works. However, men don't feel this privilege. They don't experience privilege in the same way. Navigating adolescence, navigating early adulthood, navigating Me Too and Time's Up, which are both amazing and important and really critical social movements, is also difficult to do as a guy while he's also trying to date and trying to socialize and trying to be accepted into other male spaces. Unfortunately, Me Too and Time's Up is still located within a culture that is toxically masculine in many ways. How do you navigate that? And how do we help people to maneuver around that instead of just attacking, because attacking doesn't make people listen? I will tell you, my master's degree was in health education, and very few people learn from ridicule. More people learn from positive, thoughtful approaches. Some people learn from ridicule, but very few. Okay. So in general, men feeling attacked doesn't work, and there's cultural policing both on the anti-violence side, and there's cultural policing also within masculine communities, and this can be a real bind for men trying to navigate this. So consequences for men are also incredibly great. Unhealthy masculinity, toxic masculinity, or just our general culture in general hurts men too. Violence against women and men is important to understand. Men have greater issues with substance abuse. They self-harm more, they drive drunk more. There's a whole host of things. I tried to make a joke at the end. If you look at that last bullet point, it was my attempt at a joke. But the issue here is that men suffer from men's violence as well in a great deal of ways. So understanding that the consequences for challenging men's violence actually helps men, that when we challenge this, we make your lives better and easier. So what doesn't work? You're the issue, accountability and responsibility. Men are the problem. Men are a big deal. Men are awful. These kinds of ideas are really difficult to as a starting point. They're an important point to add in at some point, but hard to start with. Men feel attacked. Once they feel attacked, they stop listening. Men don't see themselves as violence. We already talked about that. Men believe many of the social norms and myths surrounding sexual violence. So part of the issue too is changing cultural values and attitudes will also change men's behaviors and men's understanding of this. Men see this as a women's problem, and this is not, and these ironic binaries actually reinforce some of these ideas about masculinity and manhood, which we're trying to shift. So our approach at the health department is this. We take a public health approach. I don't have time to get into what that means, but if you really want to know, I'll let you know, and we can even set up a time for me to talk in more detail. But we use the social ecological model and risk and protective factors as a framework for how to base our approaches. Okay, we use a strength-based approach, which means we focus on the good thing, what you should be doing, not what you shouldn't be doing. When we do that, especially with this, how can men act as change agents? How can men be great boyfriends, fathers, husbands? How can men be great partners? How can men be great coaches? These are attitudes where we see the most promise of men feeling connected to their communities, and that connection reduces violence. And we can talk about that in more detail when we talk about risk and protective factors. You don't always need to talk about men's violence to actually make men less violent. It's amazing. Using a social norms approach, and I don't have enough time to go into that, but looking at bystander intervention strategies, which are the most productive, both as prevention and intervention strategies towards male violence. We also look at media literacy and mindful masculinity, which I don't have time to go into, but this is our generalized framework for how we look at doing this education. You can't do a don't. Somebody said this to me and I just loved it. You can't do a don't. You can't tell someone what not to do without telling them what to do or supporting them or helping them build skills, navigate things, and applying those skills. So we must define what is healthy before we say what isn't. We must define what is healthy if we're going to educate on it, and we must define what is healthy. Research is healthy if we're going to do research on it. So understanding too, like all of these are really important concepts too. It's not just telling people what not to do, it's also arming ourselves with what we should do and framing that. Risk and protective factors and social ecological model I'm not going to go into, other than to say with the social ecological model, we spend a lot of time in health education and in violence prevention education focusing on individuals and relationships. What we need to start doing is moving towards a community level shift and a societal and structural level shift. Policies, cultural norms, social norms. We spend far too little time talking about how to shift those, and you don't shift those in the same traditional ways we have historically. I'm trying to... what did I do wrong? Sorry. Okay. Social norms are really important. Beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, they can both be positive and negative. And part of the process is understanding that most men, especially the men we're working with and dealing with, unless they're very young children, are unlearning a process, not learning it. So part of that process in this teaching process is unlearning stuff culturally and socially they've been taught their whole lives. This makes things a little more complicated, and it's important to incorporate this understanding into your work, especially when you talk about ACEs, adverse childhood experience, and social determinants of health. They add and health equity adds very deep complexity into this, and part of what we talk about in general when we talk about building your prevention programming. What we look for with healthy masculinity is health, respect, connection, full range of emotional expression, equality in relationships, accountability, sacrifice, especially as it relates to men's male privilege, and then standing up against or challenging other men's violence and other people's violence. How do we do that? And that's a little bit of bystander intervention. And then finally talking about what accountability means and how to use accountability. Not you, individual, Ted, Fred, Joe are accountable, but we culturally are accountable. And what does that mean to all take accountability collectively? And how do we move forward? To me, I also want to say, what does forgiveness look like? What does vulnerability look like? How do we talk about forgiving men for a culture of male privilege and dominance that has harmed women and other men and people and vulnerable populations, while also allowing men a path forward? This is complicated again, but important to talk about with this. I've just gone through this very, very quickly, and my hope is that at the very least I've whet your appetite or curiosity towards how we could break this down. And again, we spend the presentation itself, I'm happy to do with anybody who's interested. That's my email contact, and I will answer any questions if you're opening questions. But if we don't have time, I don't want to take time away from the webinar, so I will shift back to Mar.
Thank you so much, Marty. That was, yeah, very, very thorough as you can be in 10 minutes. I know that you're really great at presenting this topic, and I would really encourage anyone who's interested in learning more from Marty to reach out to him. I know I certainly am going to. But I love what he says about, you know, that a lot of the times men don't even know that they're perpetrating violence. at Safe Harbor, we don't work with perpetrators, but we can work with avoiding perpetrators from perpetrating. So getting on the train of prevention and figuring out what works and what doesn't work is essential in moving our communities forward towards a life without violence. So I'm going to let our next guest speaker is Sam, but I'm going to let April chime in real quick, and then she can introduce Sam for us. Thank you again, Marty.
Thank you so much, Marty. So in that conversation, I think this leads into something that's really impactful because this is community-based. So did you know that the statistics about every mass shooting that has happened in the United States, and mass shooting has been defined as 4 or more people, all have an underlying common denominator of domestic violence? That usually stops the room. They were either experiencing it themselves, they were perpetrating it in any kind of fashion, but domestic violence is the one common denominator. So we know we've been impacted by that, especially in 2019. That was the most active year that the United States has ever seen. And it's not about the weapons, it's not about this, it's not about that. We have to really look and examine full circle about what's happening with our community that this is experiencing. And what we're looking at more and more in the research, which is what Marty alluded to, is that the ACE, the experience in childhood, something either long-term traumatic events, an event, something like that, but they've usually suffered from something that has traumatized themselves, and without the opportunity to understand, express, change, have a safe place to do any of that, unfortunately, it can bleed into something that's really tragic. So looking at the community, I think Sam has got some incredible information and understanding of how they've taken community and what they're doing in their approach with different men. And I find that part so encouraging, because I know that when, maybe this is the wrong thing to say, but I call it like male magic. When guys get together, they just understand each other. Now, I've seen this as a perspective from a teacher, okay? So in the teaching classroom setting, if we have challenging, upset behaviors and whatever happening, we usually call on, coach to come in. Coach just walks in, he doesn't even have to say anything. And there's just something that a lot of our guys and our kids and our teenagers, they just find that a place that they can finally start to express, talk, share. And it's fascinating to me. And I'm looking at that thinking, okay, there's something really cool here. And this is the involvement that we have when men stand up, act, come in, and they see that there is a strength there. It's so, it's what we can really do to change community. So Sam, I'm excited to hear what you have to share this evening.
Thank you, my friends. My newly adopted friends. I consider this an honor and a privilege to be here with all of you. I'm grateful for the powers that be to make this happen. Myra and April and everybody. And greetings to all of you. And somebody had made a comment on my jacket. The LA Dodgers being a world champion. And thank you, George. But I represent a group called Kava Talks, KAVA, which stands for Knowledge Against Violence Always. And the reason we chose Kava, let me give you a little bit of my background. I am Tongan. I'm from the Kingdom of Tonga, which is one of the South Pacific Islands out in the Pacific, and in the Polynesian Islands. And in our traditions, kava, which is a root that it's a beverage that's been around for as long as our existence, for thousands of years. And it's a very important part of our culture. All the major decisions that's done, it's always done around a kava circle. of where men sit around and somebody serves the kava and you talk about things. And it's a very sacred circle. And many things are discussed in that, politics, family, all the family decisions, anything in major in the villages, it's always done in the kava circle. And so the founder of Kava Talks, his name is Simi Malifo'o. He grew up and had a reputation on one of the most violent individual known to his surrounding. Was very well known. And so when he was starting this group against violence, when he went to talk to people, people laughed at him and said, "You're the most violent person we've ever known." But he had learned and grown and realized, looking back at his path and the path that he had taken and all the things that affected his life, and he wanted to make an impact to help people, specifically people in his community. So he started Kava Talks. And so it was kind of to mimic our ancient ways of doing things, of sitting around in a circle as men and discussing issues. And so he started this group for Polynesian men. And in this group, there are NFL players, there are artists, actors, singers, producers, radio DJ, and from everybody from normal walks of life that are joined in. And it's sacred. And it helps our men in our community come together and find a way that we can talk about things that are difficult, that we never talk about in our normal community outside of humor and outside of news reports. And so we come in there and it's, we take an approach in using our traditional ancient ways that we have, kept through the years and try to help with a lot of these men, because a lot of these guys are perpetrators. As the statistics show, that was a very great presentation you had there, Marty. That was very, very thorough, and I loved all the statistics and all the steps that you've shown. And a lot of the men that we have in our group are perpetrators, and a lot of them are victims. So Simi, the one that started this group, grew up and was abused as a young kid, went through a lot of that violent stuff, which made him violent, and so that violent behavior is not something that all of a sudden somebody goes, okay, today I'm going to be violent. No, that's something that's been brewing for a long time. And it becomes a culture, like that cycle that he had. You come into this world, and then you, through your caretakers, you learn all this stuff, these behaviors that you learn of this culture, and it becomes a part of you, and you go on and you teach it to somebody else, and that cycle keeps going on and on. And so, with us as Polynesian men, it's almost kind of a hush-hush thing to talk about abuse, domestic violence. And so with Kava Talks, we come in there and we make it as sacred of a circle as possible. And then we implement some of our cultural stuff. And a lot of these men are ferocious men. But with us Polynesians, we are ferocious, yet we can be so tender and loving. And it shows like a lot of stuff in our music. Most Polynesian are musical. And so music is a huge part of our ordeal. Like seeing somebody who's a tough guy growing up in the gangs and violent and stuff, grab a guitar and do something like this. Sing something as simple as a love song. I'd like to run away from you, if you would never find me. Oh, anyway, just a little bit of, but you know, imagine somebody who's coming in from very amped up. They're coming in and then you give them an instrument or you show them an instrument or have somebody that pours out his heart within that community, and people are looking at him like, man, I just seen that guy on TV, or I just seen him, you know, doing this and that, and he's out here pouring his heart out. We had one of our members, the former NFL guy, who is the only NFL player that came out gay. They came out, you know, came out of the closet to the world. He's been on Ellen and Oprah. He's got a great story. He was just recently beyond The Voice, I think last year as a contestant, because he's a big guy, was very successful, spent 10 years in the NFL, but he's got this beautiful voice, you know, but his story, hearing of his story as a gay man, and the thing that was unusual for his story in telling in our circle is that he was very masculine, very tough. When you look at him, you would not associate him with the LGBT community at all. He was just a very masculine individual. And so the stereotype that, you know, most gay guys are not masculine. And so he's able to share his story and be vulnerable in our circle, in our cover circle. And then we usually direct our conversations into something of, you know, of growth, of learning. But the main thing is, the main goal, as the title of the group, Knowledge Against Violence Always, is to help them feel comfortable enough that they can come in and display all the stuff that they have done, and then we can help them just to feel safe and trust one another, and yet provide resources and provide ways of how we can improve on those things, and realizing, you know, where a lot of that come from. And a lot of the conversations, a lot of that violent behaviors comes from fear as a child, you know, of however they treat it. And so you grow up and you know, I just saw a video the other day with Mike Tyson. They asked him how come he was so ferocious, and, you know, as a champion, he was feared. And he said it was because he was scared to death. He was so good and he was so violent because he had so much fear growing up. And so fear is a big part of this whole equation. And so we're trying to navigate through that, using all of our resources as Polynesians. You know, most of the Polynesians are connected in one way or another. You know, we have a connection out there in the sports world, the entertainment world. And so we're still navigating through all that. You know, our goal is to get Dwayne Johnson into one of our group stuff in there. You know, he has his own stories of growing up and being a violent teenager, getting into fights and all that. He was able to channel all that into something positive to where he's at right now. And so, you know, we use a lot of some of our ancient ways of cultural stuff into our conversation, you know, like having a kava circle. And kava is a very, a good way of just having everybody put their trust in the circle, that it will never leak out. Then you have a way for a lot of these youngsters that are coming in there, they're able to tell their stories, even tell you their stories of, you know, I mean, we're talking about men, very masculine men. They're talking about being raped by other men, you know, and it's a conversation you would never find anywhere. And it was just lucky enough for our Polynesian community, because therapy is pretty much non-existent in Polynesian circle. You know, the shame culture is strong. You stay, you know, you honor the family, you never shame the family. And so a lot of women carry a lot of these abuse stuff with them throughout their whole lives and never really talk about it. And so all this hush hush stuff underneath the surface that are carrying on from generation to generation. And so, like Marty said, majority of men are good men. Most of us are good. But there are some of the misinformation that's out there, that's been out there for a long time, especially in the way that we think. And so if a kid thinks he's worthless, if a kid thinks that he's amount to no good, if he's being abused, and all of that, all of those inaccurate thoughts and those things happening to him contributes to him being a bully, and the bully goes up into be something else, and eventually into something as horrific as being a mass murderer. But it starts from those little things. And so we're trying to educate people in our circle and trying to help with the healing by using some of our cultural stuff that, with this technological stuff that we're going through nowadays. And so that's what Cover Talks is all about. And I think we've had in our circle about 8 to 10 different countries, or Polynesian men from different countries, and of course all over the States, that are chiming in and learning different stuff, learning some of our cultural practice stuff, that educating people, the stuff that that doesn't work, a very masculine culture, very masculine society, and yet at the same time, we're very soft and tender. A lot of the Polynesian men that you see, especially the NFL players, you'll find most of them sitting in the locker rooms and playing love songs on their guitar and stuff, and go out and bash each other's head out. And so we have that stretch of, extreme, and that could help. You pick a lot of those, a unique part of who we are culturally, to help into this thing that's been a thorn within our society and our culture. And we're trying to better it by educating and providing resources and education into our people. So
Thank you so much, Sam. I love, April introduced you and started talking about male magic, and I feel like that, bringing men together is really, as you said, sacred, and creating that safe environment and that sacred environment that allows people to share and open up is, it's important not only for men, but for everyone. Everyone needs community. Everyone needs to feel belonging in their life. And especially when you're going through, whether you've been abused or you've perpetrated violence onto someone else, that is traumatic experience, that if you have a space that you can share that with, I think is really beautiful and empowering. And I know that you guys do a lot of talk about prevention and talking about healthy relationships and identifying what is abuse. And these are all topics that can't necessarily be introduced until there's a sense of camaraderie and trust within a group. So I think what you guys are doing is beautiful. And I hope that it inspires others to perhaps create a group similar, because I know that we need more of this within our community. So I really appreciate you being here. And for anyone that wants to learn more from Sam, I'll put his email in the chat box, if that's all right with you, Sam.
No problem. Thank you.
Awesome. And then for the purpose of time, I'm going to switch right over to Avery and have him give a little talk about gender stereotypes, which is another really important topic when we're addressing violence against women. And Avery, I will make you the co-host so you can share your screen.
So, hi guys. First of all, I'll acknowledge that it's very hard to go after Marty and Sam, Marty has an incredible wealth of knowledge that he could probably just spew off the top of his head. So that's, hard to follow. But I think Sam here has a lot of experience that I think too is hard to follow. So I will just do my best. They've also touched on a lot of stuff that I'm going to touch on. So I'll mostly skip those. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. My box I can present. Okay, so I'm talking about gender and violence. So who am I? My name is Avery. I use he, him pronouns. I like to specify that. I'm a sexual assault advocate at Safe Harbor Crisis Center. I'm also currently the only male caseworker at Safe Harbor. This isn't because we're not hiring males, it's just because, this is kind of a female dominated job. So I'm a sexual assault advocate. What do I do? Well, I'm a caseworker primarily. So I work with victims of sexual assaults, whatever that looks like for them, really. I do court advocacy, law enforcement advocacy. I accompany victims to forensic exams, what you might know as a rape kit. But I also do presentations. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about engaging boys. I have done some of the presentations at a local high school on healthy relationships. I teach our teen STAR group, which is sexual trauma and recovery. But probably the most impactful thing that I've done here is presenting at the Job Corps. I don't know if many of you guys here know what the Job Corps is, but it's a vocational program for young men and boys. It's for girls too, but I'd say it's about 90% boys and men who attend the Job Corps. And these are vulnerable populations too at the Job Corps. These are men and boys who, come from difficult backgrounds. And as a result, these are men and boys who are, possible future perpetrators, as well as, most likely victims of violence in their past. So something that we noticed about, the Job Corps was that as soon as I took it over, I started doing presentations there. We had boys disclosing sexual assaults afterwards to us in mass amounts. Men just trust other men. So, being here, if you're a guy and you're talking about this, it's that male magic maybe, but men tend to listen to other men and they tend to feel more validated by other men. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So I do have a degree in sociology, kind of an emphasis on gender and gender socialization. Here's a picture of my dogs, to kind of lighten this load a little bit. So we've already talked about this, but statistically, this is a gendered issue. Women are 5 times more likely to experience a sexual assault than men, 2 to 3 times more likely to experience violence in partner relationships. We did a study in Wales, about 44% of murder victims were domestic violence related, as versus 6% of male murder victims. I've seen similar statistics to the US. Men are overwhelmingly perpetrators. As we said, 90% of domestic violence and sexual assault perpetrators are men. But even when the victims are men, we typically see that men are the perpetrators. So not 87% of male sexual violence victims have perpetrators who are men. So this is a gendered issue. So a big question has always been, why? So I'm going to kind of approach this. Marty talked about that, higher sociological, cultural aspect. So I'm going to kind of approach it from that. So this is probably the most important bit of information that I can give you. When we do studies of convicted perpetrators of these types of violence, a majority of them have this in common, which is that they have strict views on gender and gender roles. So this means they have traditional stereotypes about what men do and what men are versus what women do and what women are. So it plays a big role in violence. How can we navigate that? How can we frame violence prevention around gender? The solution, super simple. If a lot of the gendered violence is happening because of strict stereotypes and gender roles, the good news is that the answer seems pretty simple. if you're already a huge advocate for gender equality, then you're already doing what is probably the best violence prevention. Stressing gender equality between men and women will decrease violence against women. There's studies of this, but if it starts with men and boys, if you're a guy, these statistics probably scare you. They scare me. You might feel defensive. That's okay. I'm not violent. I hope none of these men on here are violent. As we've already talked about, most men aren't. But I think that when we talk about this topic, it's not enough to be good men. We got to be great men. And I think a big part of that is going to be finding the solution and being part of the solution. You're a guy, as we already talked about, guys are more likely to listen to you. They're more likely to take your word for it. They're more likely to listen if you intervene and if you reach out to kind of stop whatever's happening. So if you're here for this conversation today, you're already there. So I agree with Marty. The term toxic masculinity tends to shut people down. But it's a huge word that's getting a lot of traction, so I am going to talk about it today. If you're a guy, you might have a visceral reaction to this term. When I bring it up, I usually always bring it up when I'm presenting to boys because I just can't help it. I do get visceral reactions. I get a lot of full body cringe. A lot of possibly my favorite reaction is hearing the phrase, "Oh, toxic masculinity is fake. It's made up," which always makes me laugh because it is fake and made up because it's not a measurable thing. It's a term, it's just a term like any other word. It's just something we use to describe behavior. Just a word for a concept and an idea, so it's not really real or fake, and that's kind of the point. Toxic masculinity is basically the way that we raise and socialize two specific things when we're raising boys. We tell them the girls and everything associated with girls is bad. We tell them it's evil, we tell them to not associate with it. And then we kind of normalize violence and aggression in their lives, Toxic masculinity, like I said, it's a term. It doesn't necessarily mean that all masculinity is toxic. It's just this aspect of masculinity that can be. So I think it's natural to get kind of defensive when we talk about it. And like, I agree with Marty. I wouldn't recommend bringing it up because it really does shut down a lot of boys and men when you do bring it up. But it's a big term, and I do think we should talk about it. So when I talk about toxic masculinity, I like to phrase it in these 4 parts. So the first part is emotional repression. So I do a lot of exercises with boys and men where I say, I talk about gender stereotypes. I say, what do men do? Like, what are men like? Tell me some of the things that you've been told about men. Tell me some of the things you've been told about women, girls. And I kind of have them create lists. The number one thing that is always written down is that boys don't cry, right? And you've probably heard this term. Who hasn't? We talk about it a lot in some form or another. But that's kind of the basic of what this emotional repression side is. We tell boys to toughen up. We tell them to stop crying. We discourage them from talking about their feelings. Because again, emotions are girly, right? We've associated emotions with girls, and thus we've discouraged men from talking about them. The second part is we kind of normalize violence and aggression. And this, I think a lot of people try to argue with, but I think it's really subtle, the ways that we do it. I like to think about, what's a boy sport versus what's a girl sport. Girl sports will maybe be like gymnastics, ballet, whereas men's sports will typically be, high contact. Even jobs, what are men's jobs? A lot of men aspire to be in the military, to be in the police, and these are high contact, possibly high physical, high violence jobs. And we just don't really push that in girls the same way. Thirdly, we tell boys to prioritize sex, kind of hypersexuality, even if it means being aggressive about it. As we've already talked about, a lot of men who are perpetrators don't think they are perpetrators, and it's because they've been raised in such a way. They're told by their peers, you know, to participate in sex. Losing your virginity is equivalent to becoming a man. You know, you're mocked relentlessly if you stay a virgin for too long. If you walk into any middle or high school, you'll probably hear so many sex jokes and so many references to male genitalia that your head will explode, you know? So even that's just hypersexuality, right? We're hypersexualizing boys and their lives. And, you know, we normalize sexual assault too. As bad as it sounds, you know, we tell men that they need to get sex no matter what that looks like. And that could be, you know, getting girls too drunk to even think straight. You know, that's so commonplace in universities and fraternities that it's, you know, it should sicken and disturb you. But it's just intrinsic to the culture, right? And all of this is just intrinsic to the culture. You know, we tell boys to rely on that sexuality, you know, to be a man. And that's more important than consent for the most part. And then lastly, and this one I think gets talked about the least, we really put a huge expectation on men to become powerful and successful, right? So men are supposed to be breadwinners. They're supposed to bring home the bacon. You know, watch any, you know, rap music video and you're probably bound to see money flying around, success flaunted in such a way. You know, we tell them, you know, that success is important. And you can even see that when you're comparing men's jobs to women's jobs. Men's jobs, you know, will be higher paid, you know, car mechanics, truckers. Women's jobs, teaching, social work, you know, these are not really high paying jobs. So, you know, if stopping violence against women isn't enough for you, as Marty said, this stuff damages men. You know, there's a lot of connection between emotional repression and high rates of suicide in men, emotional repression and drug and alcohol abuse, emotional repression and even like heart attacks. Male victims of domestic violence and sexual assault, you know, they will downplay that violence. A lot of victims of sexual assault, and this has been a big issue with the Job Corps, is that they don't even realize it's sexual assault. They've been told so thoroughly and socialized so well to believe that all sex is a good thing for them that they don't even realize when they've been sexually assaulted. Male victims of domestic violence, you know, they'll downplay that. Violence is so normalized, you know, that they'll feel weak if they talk about it. And boys are more likely to be, boys in general, young boys, more likely to be physically disciplined and abused by their parents than girls are. And they're more likely to be physically bullied in school, whereas for girls, it would be more like that emotional bullying aspect. So, you know, these are deep impacts. These are things that start young and move on throughout your entire life, you know? So how can we navigate this as men? Something I always tell men is to question your immediate reaction to things. If you love the women in your life and you respect the women in your life, then if you have an immediate reaction to be like, I can't do that, it's girly, question that, you know, stop for a second and question yourself. Because if you truly respect women and you truly love the women in your life, girly things shouldn't matter to you. There's nothing wrong with being a girl. There's nothing wrong with girly things, you know? So start to question those immediate reactions to that. And kind of going along with that is, you know, let go of some of these terms like girly and manly. You know, stuff is not gendered the way we think it is and the way we've been told it is, you know? Look at your own gender biases, stereotypes. Do you believe about men and women? Do you believe men are stronger than women? Do you believe, like, question these things? Why do you believe them? Are they necessarily true? And I really like this term, practice mindful masculinity. And this kind of goes into all those things. Question yourself, let go of these terms, let go of masculinity that doesn't benefit you. If you feel like some of these beliefs are harming you in the ways we've talked about, harming the people around you, then start to let go of them. You know, try to let them go. We really cannot begin to be prevention advocates until we have internalized these things ourselves. And, you know, I spend a lot of time on this and it still happens to me all the time. I still constantly will pause at something because, you know, in my mind's eye, it's girly, but it doesn't matter. You know, and I have to like physically stop myself and let it go because it doesn't really matter, and it doesn't benefit you to put things in these boxes, this masculinity, femininity. So be mindful about those things. So when we're teaching boys and we're, being role models for boys, be careful what you say. Again, that mindful aspect. Be careful when you say things like, hey, quit crying, be mindful of your reactions to what boys do. In this line of work, I'm exposed to a lot of children, teenagers, all that. And I do have a more visceral reaction to when a young boy cries versus when a young girl cries. I do want to get them to stop. I gotta stop letting that happen. Let boys cry, let them feel emotions, because feeling emotions and getting them out in a healthy way is, at the end of the day, going to increase your emotional intelligence. It's going to make it easier to communicate with people. Feeling emotions is good, and it's normal. Teach boys to respect women by letting them enjoy girly things if they want to. This one's hard for people to understand, but by saying, hey, Barbies, dolls are bad because girls like them, what you're saying is girls are bad. Teach boys about consent. Teach them. Start as young as you need to. Teach boys about consent. Teach boys to not push. If somebody says no, but also teach boys their own consent. Teach boys that they can say no, that they don't have to have people touch them, and this will really impact everything down the line. Like I said, be gentle with boys. I like the terms tender masculinity, as Sam was talking about. Those are strengths factors: tenderness, love, strong emotions, music. All these things are strengths factors for men, and those things can be highly intricate with your masculinity in a good way. And help boys question their own gender stereotypes. Be a model for them. So when they're watching you, they're getting full picture of what good adult masculinity looks like in a healthy way. And be safe for boys too. We've already talked about a lot of perpetrators have these feelings because they have been kind of forced on them. A lot of perpetrators who maybe commit violence later have experienced violence as well. So we want to hit that young. You want to get those kids when they're young, before they perpetrate. You really want to intervene in a way that's healthy and kind of model for them what it looks like to have healthy emotions, to respect and value consent, to push off violent tendencies. These things are all super important when we talk about prevention. So I'm not as much of an expert as I would say Marty is. Here's some of my sources for these stats and stuff. But I would say, you don't have to be an expert to want to stop violence in your community, and you are the expert for stopping violence in your community. If you're here today and you're listening to this conversation, you're already halfway there. So just be strong men, and model that behavior for young boys. And that's, kind of the end of my spiel.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate everything that you said. You have such a great perspective. And we had a training this morning at Safe Harbor about biases and privilege. And Avery just kept chiming in, and he just has so much, so many good things to say. As well as all of our guest speakers today. I hope everyone enjoyed. I'm going to turn the time back over to April real quick and allow her to wrap things up a little bit, and then I'll talk for a few minutes about the Resource Hub. Try and get out of here in the next 5 minutes. I'm sorry that we've gone over.
Thank you, Myra. So like everyone has said, how's everyone kind of feeling this evening with all of the good information? I love it. Sam's got 2 thumbs up. Thank you. We just wanted to come together and allow this opportunity for you guys to get things started. This is just the beginning. We want to meet quarterly and hopefully in groups within, possibly educators, business, community leaders, anything like that, so that when you're kind of grouped, you can express and find out, well, what's challenging within your area, your community, and then we can invite more conversations, and not just conversation, but start to take the action. So if people wanted to say, I would really like to invite Marty to something, or have Sam come and really speak specifically about these kava talks, or Avery, wow, I've got a whole group of boys, I'm with scouts or I'm with coaching and whatever. I really need some support. Now I have a place that I can go and reach out. And that was the point about this kind of overall general meeting tonight, is to get things started. And through the conversations, again, in the prevention area, many of us have a story, and unfortunately it has those damaging effects, but we always have choice. And so if we can offer choices within a community for somebody to say, you know what, this cycle has happened, and it was happening, to my dad and to my grandpa, I don't want to do this anymore, I want to break the cycle. We want to be able to have the light on these resources so people can come in and find out what they need to do. So Myra, share with us what this resource hub is going to allow anyone here within this group, other shelters, not just in Utah, but around the country, to be able to reach and connect, because we find that the more connection we have, kind of with sister shelters and so on and so forth, the more opportunities they probably have great information that can be added. And if you have great information and resources that you feel might want to be added to this resource hub, this is what Myra is, gathering and getting things all together, because we want the resources available so that it's not hidden in the dark anymore, so that we can reach out, so that it becomes a topic of conversation for people to think, yeah, I know where to go to ask for help. And that's the point. Myra, go right ahead.
Awesome. Thank you so much, April. So really quickly, I've created a resource hub. Again, we've talked about community and business leaders. We've talked about educators. We've talked about parents. We haven't talked about women today, but women are also invited to this resource hub. And everyone who's attended today will have access to this resource hub once it's live, hopefully in the next week. And if you weren't able to register for this event and weren't receiving the emails, then be sure to reach out to me. I will put my email in here so that we can make sure that you get access to this resource hub. So in the resource hub, you will find articles. You will find articles that I've reviewed, that I've read through the research and picked out the most important pieces to share with you all. You'll find videos. You'll find other webinars like this one. You will find curriculum that has been used throughout the country. So a lot of a broad range of resources, but all things that I've handpicked to give to community leaders, business leaders, educators, and parents and women as well. So hopefully, again, as April said, the hope in this is that the conversation continues to grow, that you receive access to this resource hub, that if you find other resources you want to add to it, you can do that. And then we'll meet once every 3 or 4 months and talk about the things that we're finding in the resource hub, as well as, April and myself are going to continue adding things in there. And these are all tools designed to broaden your knowledge on this topic and help you and empower you to prevent violence within the community. So again, if you haven't registered for this webinar and you've received the link elsewhere, make sure you email me so I have your email address so you can receive access to the webinar. Again, this will hopefully be live in the next week. And if anyone has any questions about the resource hub or for Marty, Avery, or Sam, we'll stay on for a few minutes, but I know that we've gone over on time and I don't want to take any more of your time this evening, so I will wrap things up and thank everyone for attending. Again, if you have any questions, please let us know, but thank you so much for being here.
Real quick, Myra, I was wondering if we could possibly have some kind of way to opt into like a mailing list or contact lists for people around here.
Yeah, so everyone who's registered for the webinar, which I think you have, Jorge, you'll have access to that.
Cool. All right, thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Thanks for putting this together, Mara and April. This was great.
Thank you so much for being here, Marty.
Thank you, Marty.
Yes, great job, April, Myra. Great job, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.